Good evening, everyone. I am Charlotte Vignon, Curator of Decorative Arts at the Frick Collection. It's a pleasure to welcome you all tonight, and I am thrilled to introduce our speaker for this lecture, Edmund de Waal. Edmund really needs no introductions. However, I would like to tell just a few words about this world-renowned artist and best-selling author. Edmund's art and literature speak to his fascination with the nature of objects and the narrative of their collection and display. With his sculptures and installation, he explores themes of diaspora, identity, inheritance, and loss, as well as materiality. Through his written and artistic practice, he has broken new ground in the history and potential of ceramics, as well as on architecture, music, dance, and poetry. Edmund's recent museum exhibitions include responses to the Italian artist Giorgio Morandi at the Artipelag in Stockholm, to the collection of the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, with a focus on the theme of anxiety, and an architecture intervention made in response to the Viennese architect Rudolf Schindler at the Schindler House in Los Angeles. Most recently, Edmund became the first contemporary artist to create a major exhibition for the Venetian Ghetto. Called Psalm, the extraordinary two-part exhibition was unveiled just a month ago, or earlier this month, to coincide with the opening of the Biennale. Edmund is also a very celebrated author, having written The Air with Amber Eyes and The Wide Road, Journey into an Obsession. And this year we wrote together a new volume in the Diptychs series of the Frick Collection. And this book focuses on a pair of porcelain candelabra with gilt bronze mounts by Pierre Gautier, acquired by the Frick Collection in 2016. Edmund also wrote a beautiful text that he called once an autobiography of sorts, and it's published in the catalogue for the Frick exhibition, Elective Affinities. The themes Edmund explores, the nature of his work, often in conjunction with historical collections and places, and his identity as an artist and a writer, together with his long love affair with the Frick, made him the ideal artist to invite to create new site-specific works, 9 in total, in dialogue with the museum's permanent collection. Tonight, Edmund will explore his long relationship with the Frick and his response to particular places, objects, and paintings in the galleries. He will also discuss the personal significance collecting has for him in his life and in his artistic practice. The exhibition, so the museum, will remain open for half an hour after the lecture. Please be also advised that this lecture will be live streamed and available on our website for future viewing. Before we commence, I would ask you to turn your phones on or put them on silence. And now, please, give a very, very warm welcome to Edmund de Waal.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm amazed there are so many people here tonight. Congratulations. I would like to apologize in a British, embarrassed way for the weather, but really it is not my fault. We could lower the lights, if that's all right. And you can fall asleep and look at Chardin. Where do you begin? I begin with the privilege of standing here. I begin with the privilege of this invitation to work with this incredible place, with the stories, the collections, the histories, the overlapping narratives, of materiality, of collecting, of identity that happen within this place, this extraordinary vitrine that is the Frick. But I'm also going to start with being 17 and running away from home to New York, staying on a friend's floor downtown and coming on a winter's afternoon almost at the last moment as the Frick was almost closed, and being baffled by this place, being baffled by the art, by the arrangement of the rooms, by the lack of light, but coming across this Chardin. I'd run away from England because I was going to be a potter. I already knew that pots were my life. I'd spent all my teenage life every afternoon in a potter's studio, obsessionally making pots. I had an apprenticeship ahead of me both in England and Japan. I knew what vessels meant, but I stood in front of this painting and there was something about this placement of objects, that carafe of water, that half-drunk glass of water, those plums with the bloom on them just fading, those two squashes pivoting in that corner, and above all, the way in which they were placed in the world. These weren't objects that were free-floating in space. This didn't feel like still life in any way that I knew it. It was about objects known and handled, objects put down in the world, which had presence, which had some kind of meaning in the world. And I knew at that moment, because it was an epiphany, that there was something about how objects are placed in the world that I needed to work with. I'm still working with this epiphany. Epiphanies are interesting. Epiphanies are moments when something happens, when something irrevocable happens. That's what epiphany means. Something irrevocable happens and the world goes on exactly the same. It's a very interesting moment. This was my epiphany, and it happened here, just round the corner, almost 40 years ago. So that's my origin story, and I'm interested in origin stories. I'm interested in foundational myths, and this is a place where we can talk together about foundational myths. We can talk about Frick, and we can talk about where he comes from. We can talk about steel. We can talk about how objects and materials and wealth and identity are forged. And it doesn't matter whether it's steel with Frick or in some odd parallel, it's porcelain with me, Jingdezhen in China, the other end of the world where porcelain is invented, or Stoke-on-Trent in Britain, or Cornwall, where the landscape is ravaged in the pursuit of white clay. Or I could show you pictures of black and white photographs of ravaged landscapes all night. That's probably not what you came for. But foundational myths matter. Where do you come from? And what are you going to do about the place you come from? So what about this place? What about Frick? And what about this extraordinary picture here? When I see this picture, I hear it. This, of course, the forge by El Greco, you see that great hammer coming down. You hear, it's an oral picture. You hear that percussive sound of one hammer blow coming down and metal being forged. This, for me, is one of the keys for how I approach working here at the Frick. The beginnings with metal, that moment of alchemy. It leads me to the whole palette of materials, the group of materials I've brought together to have dialogue with the materials of the frick. So this is a painting we'll come back to, and you'll hear this picture. What does this lead me to? It leads me to the materials I use. It leads me to steel. It leads me to porcelain, and it leads me to gold. These are the materials I use when I'm thinking about the frick. Porcelain, because I make porcelain. Because the frick is full of porcelain. Because the frick has one of the greatest porcelain collections in the world. Great overlapping collections. First from Frick himself, and then extraordinary iterative collections that have been given and are still being given to the Frick. Most latterly, of course, the great storied collection of Henry Arnholt, who we celebrate day by day, his collection of Meissen, that is now here and coming due to his family. Porcelain, steel because of Frick, and gold. Is there another place in the world where there is more gold than the Frick? So how do we get from steel to this, to the creation of this extraordinary building? How do we get here and we walk up these stairs and we come into this great fantasy, this extraordinary place, this vitrine, a word we'll come back to. How do we get there? Foundational myths. Now, we don't have terribly long, so I'm not going to give you my foundational myths, except there is another foundational myth. I'm not going to tell you the story about my foundational myth, the shtetls that lead to Odessa, that lead to Paris, that lead to the Rue Monceau, that lead to family houses on the Ringstrasse, which lead to gold, which lead to this extraordinary, dreadful house in Cap Ferrat. But those are my foundational myths, and that's not the lecture you're getting tonight. No Netske in this lecture. What you're getting is South London. You're getting my workshop in West Norwood next to the bus garage. That's where we're going to start. West Norwood, next to the bus garage. You come to the studio, it's an old gun factory. It's where they tested guns and made rifles and filled ammunition, cartridges. You go up the stairs, and this is my beautiful, modest, slightly monastic place where I sit and make pots when I'm allowed to. It's a wheel, a potter's wheel. You can see it there. It's a bench that I've been using now for almost 40 years, and it is still hugely uncomfortable when my body now needs that particular bench. So I sit there, sometimes with my dog, Isla, sitting there accompanying me. This is the only dog you're having in the whole lecture. Feast your eyes, Isla, our dog. And this is me sitting and making one pot after another from white porcelain clay. White porcelain clay. Clay that has been invented in Jingdezhen, that second smoky slide I showed you, reinvented. In Meissen, reinvented in Cornwall. And now my clay comes in bags from Limoges, good French porcelain clay, the kind of clay that the people in Sèvres would understand. And I sit here and I make one pot, and then I make another. It's an iterative process, one thing after another. And when I do this, that's because I'm making the sound of making pots, the percussive sound of one ball of clay after another. Remember the forge, that extraordinary hammer blow that creates the steel. Why do I do this? I make my vessels, and then they have a different life. Down the stairs, into the kiln, fired. But they need a place to be. They need a home. That's not some cliché. That's not some ersatz domestic way of Framing things, they need a place to be in the world. Remember Chardin, remember that epiphany. You put something down in front of something else, it tells a story. So where do I put my vessels? I find spaces for them. I find spaces in the studio, vitrines. I put vitrines on the wall, but I start in the studio, but then things have to leave. Things have to go out into the world. This is an installation that I made for Vienna, that difficult place, for the Tatius Temple on the Ringstrasse, 264 white pots in 2 vitrines in a neoclassical space. What am I doing? I'm trying to put pots next to each other in a percussive way, in an oral way, just like poetry happens on a page, to try and see how the spaces between the objects work, trying to understand how space and object work together, how you put something down in the world and something happens. There is a point to this lecture, I'm getting there. This is white porcelain. This is how I think of objects. So when I'm sitting with or without my lovely dog at my feet in my studio and I'm listening to music, I'm thinking about here. I'm thinking about this invitation, which has happened over the years from the Frick, to come back, to talk, to be in conversation with the curators, with the scholarship, with the place, with the community of the Frick, with the paintings and the architecture and the spaces of the Frick. What on earth am I going to do? What am I going to do with these spaces? How can I possibly bring anything into the Frick? Is there room in the Frick? How can you put anything down in the Frick? How can you displace anything in the Frick? How can it not be some huge hubristic act? How can you be genuinely in conversation with the Frick? It's a real conversation. I sit, listen to my music in my studio, mostly the Goldberg variations, and I think about the Frick. And what am I thinking? I'm thinking about layering. I'm thinking about how in these spaces, more than in any other museum, I know it's not a museum, this is a house, this is a collection, it's a vitrine. Museum? Museum is too weaselly a word to use for the Frick. It's an event. I'm thinking about layering, about how in this place one object is wrapped in another, how one object is placed on a plinth, on a table, on a carpet, in a space, so that it's in front of another object with another painting behind it. How one thing talks to another. How there is extraordinary, powerful mobility within this situation. This is not a museum where things are settled. It's a place where things are contingent. This is not the view of the Frick that people think of. This is a place of mobility, not of stasis. I sit, I listen to music, and I think about all these different spaces I could possibly be in. And I think about origins, and I think that this, possibly, is the place for me to work with black porcelain. Why black porcelain? Black porcelain because black porcelain is part of another origin myth. Remember Meissen, 1700. You're a hugely educated audience. Why do I have to say remember? You know all about Meissen in 1700. You know that extraordinary story of alchemy, how the alchemist and the philosopher were bundled together and imprisoned by Augustus the Strong with his Maladie de Porcelain, his Porzellan-Krankheit, his obsession with porcelain. Make porcelain and make gold. And they're desperate to make porcelain. They're desperate to make white, mesmeric, beautiful porcelain. And they end up by making black porcelain. That's the first thing they do. They make black porcelain. They can't work out the secret, and they make black porcelain. So porcelain begins with black. So when I'm in these spaces, I want to use black porcelain. Origin myths. And so what I choose to do is to think of these two great tables at either end of the West Gallery, one talking to the other, that great pairing that begins in the West Gallery. And then I think that the West Gallery is full of pairings, full of dialogue, call and response. The great double portraits, some of the greatest double portraits in the world are there. My God, think of them. And the great, extraordinary rhythms that happen in that space. And so I decide that what I'm going to do is to use these two great tables, talking across this vast, terrifying space. And what I'm going to do is to make my own double portraits, my own response to this doubleness, this sounding line that happens throughout these spaces. And that's what I've done. They are on steel bases, heavy steel bases, huge vitrines. These are the biggest freestanding, but of course they're the biggest. It's the Frick, for goodness sake. What do you want? Modesty. Double. This isn't being taped, is it? It is being taped. I think I might have lost my moment there. Double vitrines. And what I do here is to stack one in front of another so that they are a kind of lens through which you see the gallery. And then you see the stacking here. This is one piece of steel on top of another. Remember the forge, that extraordinary repetition, that percussive repetition of one thing on top of another, the bang, bang, bang of the hammer, or me at the wheel, the porcelain, one thing after another. So in these vitrines, there is porcelain and there is steel brushed here, oxidized in other places. This is me talking to the origins of Frick, talking back to Frick about the one material I can't find here, the steel. And then they're placed on these great Renaissance tables, these great, huge, vast tables that weigh a ton and can take the pressure of my vitrines. And here they are, and look at, my God, look at that image. I mean, look there, I'm looking at Rembrandt, but my God, Rembrandt is looking at me. That's the gaze that you never believe will happen. That's the gaze you never believe will happen. That's where I could just walk off the stage and walk down East 70th Street forever. But this is what I'm trying to do. Talk to the Frick. Try and be present within it, but try and produce a new way of framing just a part of the collection, just that part of a Rembrandt self-portrait, or that part just over there of a table, or that extraordinary view down from the West Gallery into the enamels room, just taking apart a frame and holding it within a vitrine. We'll come back to vitrines. We will come back to vitrines. That's the West Gallery. I'm running out of time. And now we're in England. I always imagine here, Frick standing at one of those windows and opening it and looking down over the fields towards a river and a capability brown landscape garden, and thinking of himself as the Duke of Devonshire. This is England on Fifth Avenue. This is the fantasy, that mesmeric, beautiful, poised, golden, celadon fantasy of entitlement. And my God, it makes me want to break things. So what do I do here? I want to be here. I'm, after all, English, partly English, sometimes English. But here, I want to break things. I think about this room, and what do I see? I see great garnitures, great formal, beautiful gavottes of porcelain on that extraordinary table, the silver, the great Gainsborough portraits. I see this extraordinary, slow, mesmeric fantasy of Englishness, of poise, of ownership, of daughters to marry, of more wealth ahead of you. And what I choose to do is to make two installations which talk, I think, to the objects in the room, to talk to the objects in the room, to talk to that extraordinary formality of this room. So what I do is to make porcelain of incredible fragility, the most delicate porcelain I've ever made. You pick it up and it's translucent. You see your hand through it. It's really very beautiful. And then I make strong steel containers, heavy steel containers with nothing in them. They're powder-coated. You see them here. And I lean this porcelain up against it, golden porcelain and white porcelain up against these steel containers, and then I make a small steel container, and I endlessly, obsessionally write poems from Emily Dickinson into porcelain, and I break them up. I break them into shards. I mix them with gold, and I make a box of poetry inside the vitrines. Why Emily Dickinson? Why Emily Dickinson? Because if you can think of a stronger poet to sit next to a Gainsborough girl, tell me it. So I bring Emily Dickinson to talk to Gainsborough. And these vitrines here, they sit on those extraordinary marble tables underneath the Gainsborough portraits, and they are my way of trying to avoid Englishness. I call these vitrines On Living in an Old Country. I'm troubled. But that's what the Frick does, because you move from that extraordinary space and suddenly you're here. Frick is being French. Frick wants to be French. It's desire, it's eroticism, it's pursuit, it's this extraordinary hiding and revelation of the Fragonard. One of the most powerful, extraordinary, mesmeric spaces that I know of in the world. Where are you? Where are you when you're in the Fragonard room? Where are you when you're in the Fragonard room? It's a real question. It's a real question to ask yourself, because there you are with these paintings, with that chimney piece, with the Gautier bronzes, with this extraordinary central table, with amazing Sèvres held, clasped in gold, porcelain wrapped in gold, and it's one layer on top of another. It's one playing tag with one story after another. Are you on Fifth Avenue or not? You've just moved from an English dining room into the Fragonard room. It's an extraordinary, different kind of epiphany. And being here, I think about materiality. Where's the porcelain here? What am I going to do in response to this? And so what I do is to choose to make this. It's my first ever golden vitrine. And damn it, where else in the world would I choose to make a golden vitrine than here? It's yours, a golden vitrine for the Frick. It sits on deep plexi, a deep plinth of plexiglass, so it floats, and it's steel gilded beautifully. And inside this vitrine is another piece, steel, and then a stack of porcelain bowls, 3, another stack of 2 held, and then within them, fragments of gold. What I've done is to take that Sèvres garniture, take the gold from the chimney piece, capture it. This is me capturing it. I'm waving my arms around for those of you who can't see me. Capture the gold, turn it into porcelain, and then break it. Shards are really interesting. Shards matter enormously. So when you go and see this piece in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, when I finish this talk, you'll see that there's hidden shards within this. And this whole piece sits on this extraordinary, extraordinary cabinet, this beautiful cabinet with the head of Apollo. This is one of the most beautiful sculptures in the world, this head of Apollo, this gilded head. So damn it, the people, I'm swearing too much, I'm sorry, but honestly, everyone can walk you around the frick and show you the masterpiece. They can tell you exactly how to get to the Polish rider. But this cabinet is a masterpiece. This is a masterpiece. This is one of the great sculptures of the world. And it's there in the Fragonard room. And so what I've done is to make a floating vitrine, a homage to this fantasy, this extraordinary place, and put it there. And I've called the piece On the Archaic Torso of Apollo. It's a poem from a fragment of a poem by Rilke. Of course, we have to get Rilke in somewhere. But there it sits, a golden vitrine. And maybe people won't see it. People won't see it. And do you know what? If they don't see it, that's fantastic. Because one of the things about this exhibition is about being present with some kind of kindness to these spaces, some kind of genuine conversation with these spaces. It's not about showing off. So let's talk about her. Let's talk about her, and let's talk about this extraordinary painting and the frame behind her, the frame of that mirror, and that mantelpiece. And when you look at that mantelpiece, you'll see that there is also a garniture of porcelain gilded behind her. It's a shuffled garniture. It's partly seen, and you can see it's there, just. When I look at it, I think of that wonderful line by Francis Bacon where he's talking about how objects work in the world, and he says, pay attention to the shuffle of things in the world. There she is, pensive and beautiful, but there's also the shuffle of things around her in her space. And below her, of course, is this extraordinary Turquoise marble table with these mounts by Gautier, the alchemist, carver, goldsmith, creator of the greatest carvings of 18th century France. You want to know more? Read Charlotte's beautiful book that she's just published. And I also written an essay in the same book. But here, in this table, look at this and think about picture and painting together. Think about how they talk to each other. Think about what you do with this response between place and image. What do you do? There is normally gilded porcelain, mounted porcelain of great significance here. And what I've done is to make my second gilded vitrine called the Pause of Space, which is here. It sits again on a deep piece of plexiglass. It's gilded, and inside this are vessels of some austerity. They're unglazed, fired to a huge temperature, higher than I normally fire, so that they're almost bone-like in their color and their feeling. And then I've made very, very thin pieces of porcelain, gilded them and leaned them, lent them, leaned them, lent them between them. So this is another shuffle of things. And here in this vitrine, the pause of space, what I'm doing is borrowing a part of Ingres by looking up, and borrowing a part of Gautier by looking down. You look up, you look down, and this holds the center stage. Why? What vitrines do is really interesting. This is now where you get my bit about vitrines. But I need water. Vitrines, and I did actually write a book about 264 Netscape in a vitrine, which took me 7 years. So I have got some background on vitrines. That's my footnote. It sounded a little defensive. It wasn't meant to be defensive. What vitrines do is absolutely fascinating. Vitrines are a way of framing the world. They borrow space. They borrow light and they borrow air for a while. But what they also do, and this endlessly fascinates me, it's something I think about a lot, is that they seem to pause space. When you put an object down in the world, when I put this glass of water, plastic, I'm afraid to say, glass of water down in front of this carafe of water, it can be moved anywhere. It's contingent, it's on its way, it's diasporic, it can move anywhere in the world. But you put one object and another object down in the vitrine, and suddenly space and time are paused. And that's really, really interesting. Time takes a break, just for a bit. And what you do when you see that is a kind of choreography of objects, that things are held in a particular kind of space and time. So when you're working with vitrines, what you're desperately, or I am desperately trying to do, is to test the space in which I'm putting my objects down. Test the space I'm putting my objects down. See how they can work with a frame. How much, someone today said, why is there so much air there? Couldn't it have been smaller as a vitrine? And the answer is no, it couldn't. When I think about the interiority, the space, the breath within these vessels, they needed that amount of air to live and be paused. And actually, this exhibition, working its way through this extraordinary space, is really immodestly an attempt to try and pause you a little as you move through these spaces, pause you in particular places, pause you and make you possibly frame the world just a little differently. End of stump speech on vitrines. Gautier, mounted porcelain. This way of bringing whiteness and gold together is mesmeric. It's mesmeric because porcelain is, of course, white gold. So to bring white gold and gold together is to start to take the language of alchemy very seriously indeed. But gold is also about aura. It's about how light works around it. It's about how light is displaced and refracted and moves. And one of the things that I've tried to do is to think about sacred space and aura with gold. So when I'm here, and I've only done this because you can see Gautier there in the Boucher room, and then you can see me, but my God, you can see Van Eyck. What I'm trying to do is to try and take aura really, really seriously. And this is the exhibition where I've pushed myself further and deeper to look at how gold works in space, how beautiful golden light is than any other thing, any other place, any other exhibition. This is the place to try it out. This is the place to endlessly try it. These are different trials of gold. I have a good studio. We try out different golds. Do you know that Korean moon gold is very, very expensive indeed? But that's why when you're faced with this, incredibly moving, tender exploration of encounter, and you want to make a piece that works in connection with this and with those extraordinary sacred paintings that surround this, you have to start thinking about how you're going to hold gold, hold light, and bring them together. This is a piece that I've called Annunciation. That's not the painting above. It's not an Annunciation, but Annunciation, because Annunciation is that extraordinary moment of encounter between two people, well, an angel and a person, that extraordinary, powerfully coded moment of encounter. And what I'm trying to do in this sculpture here, for this particular space, is to make an encounter, make an annunciation. This is me actually coming out and saying, I care about the sacredness of art. When you go and look at it, I hope it slows you down. I hope it pauses you. I hope that aura that seems to come from nowhere, from these places of these gilded inside spaces that are created by these gilded brackets and moves across the porcelain, is in some senses an annunciation. An annunciation. I have thought about this a fair amount. How do you try and respond properly and fully to that image of encounter? 7 years ago, I made a series of pieces where I tried to hide the porcelain within cabinets. I called this an English Matins. It was a way of trying to begin to think about the opening of a prayer book or the closing of a credenza or the extraordinary feeling that you can get with sacred art. But then coming here with Duccio, I'm thrown back. I'm thrown back onto my back foot and think, I desperately want to work with this painting, this gold ground, extraordinary, this moment, this alternative annunciation, this alternative encounter between Christ and the devil. So in that enamels room, when you get there on a very beautiful Renaissance table, I've made this piece, which I have with great imagination called, what have I called it? I've gone and lost its name. Charlotte, you'll know it. The Temptation of Christ in the Mountain. Okay, we're going to call it that. It's now called The Temptation of Christ in the Mountain. Gone completely blank. It's what the Duccio is called. I've called it after the Duccio, damn it. That's what it's called. And there it is. And what I've done is to make the thinnest porcelain vessels you can imagine. They are of huge delicacy and they can fall over in a breath. And pieces of thin porcelain and gold. And this whole piece sits there under the Duccio and it talks about another kind of annunciation, this encounter here. And do you know what? I think actually it works quite well. Right. Here. And actually this is interesting because this shows you this slide, that people who say nothing ever moves at the Frick, I came here with my grandmother in 1937 and nothing's ever changed, are all wrong because things keep changing at the Frick. And look, there's the clock, just to prove it. It's not there now. But the living hall, what do we feel when we're in this space? What do we feel when we see this incredible Boule table? A table that tells you about authority and power. What do you do when you see this Boule table and you look up and you see men of power? This extraordinary sextet of portraits that surround Frick in the living hall. The Pope, Cromwell and more. And behind us, Bellini and Titian. What do you feel when you're in this space? This is the space where I imagine Frick writing at this desk and see him alongside these icons of power. And on this desk, normally, habitually, are Renaissance bronzes. So what I've done is to take away the bronzes. And there are very few things in this exhibition where I've actually taken work away. But here I've taken away those bronzes, and I've made these, well, here we go. Here are men of power. But what I've done is to take away those and make these very tall, thin vitrines, which are heavy steel bases on which there are very, very thin black pieces of porcelain, and then the thinnest pieces of steel which lean one way or another in a kind of restless way. And I'm talking about power. I'm talking about making something which has authority, but putting it alongside these images of these people who are so full of authority. But when you look at them, each of them has a missal or has a piece of paper in their hands. Each of them is somewhere on some extraordinary journey of some complexity. So it's a way of me thinking aloud about work. Because work is so central to the Frick. Work and power. How Frick makes this collection. How he brings things together. How he accumulates through desire and love and desperation. And how he creates one identity after another, one room replacing another, so that the whole of the spaces are a kind of palimpsest. So that when you come to the library, and damn it, I'm convinced that Frick never read a book in his life, and you look down at Mr. Frick, look up at Mr. Frick, and you look down at the desk, and those who have better eyesight than me will see in this central desk made by Olsen, the great, not so great architect of Buckingham Palace, but we're not going to go there. You'll see this is the Book of Wealth in 12 volumes. This is the oligarch's how-to guide to be even richer than Carnegie up the road or Rockefeller, wherever Rockefeller is on Fifth Avenue. So this is Frick's bedtime reading. So what do? This is me talking about work and power. I take away the Book of Wealth. It's stored beautifully elsewhere. And I make a piece which is inserted into that space. Thank you for that nice reaction. And do you know what? I'm absolutely convinced in the 5 months that I'm allowed to camp here with my sleeping bag at the Frick, that very few people are going to find this installation. It's called an Alchemy. It's a piece of steel, blackened steel. It's 3 vitrines, and you can see that stack of steel. And then pieces of black porcelain, and into the biggest piece there is another porcelain vessel that I've broken up. And my God, I like the sound of breaking porcelain in the morning. It's extraordinary. I break up a black porcelain vessel and I mix it with golden porcelain shards. And when you go there, actually you all have to go there and find it in the library and look down. You'll see one piece of gold has edged its way to the top. So there in the library is an alchemy. And finally, you'll be relieved to hear a piece that I've called Steel Light. One of my questions, working here with Charlotte and with all the team here, was to think about not only how you move through the Frick, how you look and pause and retrace your steps and get reminded of one thing after another. The way in which one experience here at the Frick is a sort of palimpsest, a kind of writing over of another, and how one collection that comes in is another part of the palimpsest of this extraordinary institution. But how light works here, how light is diffused and comes in, how directional light and subdued light happens in this extraordinary building. And there is one space in the West Vestibule looking out towards the garden and looking out over the road to Central Park where there is strong light coming in. And this great cabinet of monumental musculature sitting there with, it's a good word to have used actually, I don't know where that came from, sitting there with Boucher's Four Seasons around it, this extraordinary piece. And so what I've done is to make my final piece, which is 5 pieces of solid, heavy, hefty steel, on which there's porcelain, on which there are these thin pieces of steel. I tried to get steel from Pittsburgh. It's from Manchester. I'm sorry. I apologize. I really wanted, in a coded way, to bring that in, but damn it, I couldn't do it. And then gold, which catches the light from the park, from the air. And this is my piece hugely personally for Frick himself. It's called Steel Light. And it's me talking to him and me thinking about how he collects, why he collects, and why he gives it away. Why he gives it away. That extraordinary story of all that accumulation, of all that terrifying, driven velocity of his life, and then that giving it away, that act. And that makes me think about collecting, why I make, why I bring objects together, pause them in space, try and collect them, try and put them down somewhere with some conviction in the world, and know that they'll be there for a while and then go away, because that's what things do, because they are diasporic. But here at the Frick, to be able to talk about collecting and diaspora, to talk about passion and conviction and material, and to talk absolutely about epiphany. I talk about epiphany as a 17-year-old boy and what it meant to come here. That's why this invitation has been one of the great, extraordinary, marvelous, mesmeric moments of my life, and I am so unbelievably grateful. Unbelievably grateful. Thank you.